Washington, D.C. was waking up, the city's marble monuments glowing with the first blush of sunrise. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of rain from the night before. General Grace Williams pulled her sedan to the curb outside a small, locally owned coffee shop, a rare moment of ordinary life before another day of extraordinary responsibility. Grace was a woman who commanded attention, even in civilian clothes. Her posture was straight-backed, her gaze steady, her presence quietly formidable. She wore her hair in a neat bun, a habit from decades in the Army. At 53, she had seen more of the world's darkness and hope than most would in several lifetimes. Her uniform, today left hanging in her closet, bore ribbons and medals that spoke of courage, sacrifice, and a relentless pursuit of justice. But this morning, she was simply Grace. She craved a strong cup of coffee and a few minutes of solitude before her debriefing at the Pentagon. She had just returned from a classified mission overseas, one that would never make the headlines, but would shift the balance of global power. Her mind was still half on the coded reports in her briefcase, half on the memory of her father's words. "Never forget who you are, Grace. And never let them forget it either." As she stepped out of her car, she noticed two police officers across the street. Their squad car idled, headlights cutting through the dawn. Grace felt their eyes on her, sharp, assessing, lingering a little too long. She was used to scrutiny, but this was different. She could sense the tension, the unspoken questions. Even here, in the heart of the nation's capital, the color of her skin could draw suspicion before her achievements could draw respect. She walked into the coffee shop, ordered a black coffee, and waited by the window. Outside, the officers conferred quietly, glancing at her car, then at her. Grace sipped her coffee, studying herself. She had spent a lifetime navigating rooms where she was the only woman, the only black person, the only voice for those who had none. She had learned to read the room, to anticipate danger, to stand her ground with dignity. As she left the shop, coffee in hand, the officers approached. Their faces were unreadable, their hands resting near their belts. Grace's heart beat a little faster. Not from fear, but from the familiar calculation. What will they see? A threat? A target? Or just a woman on her way to work? "Excuse me, ma'am," the taller officer said. His voice was polite, but his eyes were cold. "Is this your vehicle?" "Yes," Grace replied, her tone calm and measured. "Is there a problem, officer?" "We've had reports of a suspicious vehicle in the area," he said, glancing at her car. "Mind if we ask you a few questions?" Grace met his gaze. "I'm on my way to work. If you'd like to see my ID, I'm happy to show it." The second officer, younger and more nervous, shifted his weight. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, almost apologetically. Grace handed over her driver's license, her military ID tucked discreetly behind it. She watched as the officers studied her name, her photo, her rank. She saw the flicker of uncertainty in their eyes, the internal debate. Was this really the person they wanted to stop? She had been here before, in 100 different ways. The questions were always the same, whether in a boardroom or on a street corner. "Do you belong here? Are you a threat? Will you comply?" Grace stood tall, her voice steady. "Officers, I have a meeting at the Pentagon in 20 minutes. If you have questions, I'll answer them. But I expect to be treated with the same respect I offer you." For a moment, the city seemed to hold its breath. The sun rose a little higher, casting long shadows on the street. Grace Williams, daughter of a civil rights lawyer and a schoolteacher, stood unflinching in the face of suspicion. She was no stranger to battles, she just hadn't expected to fight one here, on Constitution Avenue. Before breakfast, Grace could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, even as she tried to maintain her composure. The taller officer, whose name tag read Miller, handed her license back with a practiced flick. His partner, Sanders, lingered by the passenger side, eyes darting between Grace, her car, and the bustling city street. "Mind if we take a look inside your vehicle?" Miller asked, his tone casual but his stance rigid. Grace met his eyes, unwavering. "Do you have probable cause?" she asked, her voice even. Years of military training had taught her to recognize both overt threats and the subtle ones hidden in procedure. Miller's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, we're just trying to keep the neighborhood safe. You fit the description of someone reported in the area. If you have nothing to hide, this won't take long." Grace's grip on her coffee cup tightened, the warmth grounding her. She glanced at the people passing by. Some slowed, curiosity piqued, while others looked away, unwilling to get involved. She knew this moment was about more than a routine stop. It was about who was seen as belonging and who was seen as suspect. "I'm happy to cooperate," Grace said, "but I'd like to know what description I supposedly fit." Sanders shifted uncomfortably. "Female, African American, driving a dark sedan," he recited, avoiding her gaze. Grace let out a slow breath. "That could describe half the women in this city," she replied quietly. Miller's patience seemed to thin. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Grace complied, moving with the deliberate, precise movements of someone used to command. She kept her hands visible, her posture upright. She knew the script, how quickly things could escalate if she made a single wrong move. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, Miller gestured for her to place her hands on the hood of her car. The metal was still cool from the morning air. She felt the indignity of the moment, but refused to let it show. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, her voice steady. "Just procedure," Miller replied, though his tone betrayed a hint of defensiveness. Sanders patted down her pockets. "Searching for weapons or contraband?" Finding nothing, he nodded to Miller, who pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Grace's heart pounded. "Officers, I am not resisting. I would like to call my attorney." Miller shook his head. "You can make a call at the station. Right now, you're being detained for questioning." The cuffs clicked around her wrists, cold, tight, final. The sound echoed in the early morning quiet, drawing the attention of more bystanders. A young woman across the street raised her phone, recording. Grace stood tall, refusing to let humiliation bend her spine. She thought of her mother, who'd once marched for justice in Selma, and her father, who'd argued civil rights cases in courtrooms across the South. They had taught her that dignity was something no one could take, unless you let them. "Officers," Grace said, her voice low but clear, "I want you to remember this moment. You have no idea who you just handcuffed." Miller scoffed. "You're not the first to say that." Grace turned to the bystander with the phone. "Miss, could you please dial a number for me? It's urgent. Just tell them General Grace Williams needs immediate assistance." The woman hesitated, then nodded, her hands shaking as she dialed. Grace recited the number from memory, a secure line she'd use only in the gravest emergencies. The phone rang twice. Then a clipped, authoritative voice answered. "Pentagon secure line. Identify yourself." "This is General Grace Williams. I am being unlawfully detained by officers badge numbers 4872 and 5193. I request immediate verification of their authority and my release." The effect was immediate. Miller's face drained of color. Sanders stepped back, his mouth opening and closing in shock. The bystander's eyes widened as she realized the gravity of the situation. Within seconds, the police radio crackled to life. "All units, stand down. Repeat, stand down. Release the detainee immediately." Miller fumbled with the keys, unlocking the cuffs with trembling hands. "Ma'am, we didn't know." Grace rubbed her wrists, her expression unreadable. "That's the problem," she said softly. "You never know." As she gathered her belongings, the crowd around her murmured, some in outrage, others in awe. Grace straightened her jacket, her dignity intact. She turned to the officers one last time. "You need to ask yourselves why you stopped me, and what you would have done if I hadn't had the power to call for help." With that, she walked away, her head held high, leaving behind a silence heavier than any accusation. Grace's stride was measured and unbroken as she left the scene, but inside, her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. She was no stranger to confrontation, but this was the first time in years she'd felt so exposed, so reduced to nothing but a description in the eyes of authority. The Pentagon's secure line had saved her, but she knew most people in her position would not have had such a lifeline. That knowledge stung deeper than any bruise. As she reached the end of the block, a sleek black SUV pulled up. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, badges flashing. "General Williams?" one asked, his tone brisk but respectful. "We're with the Department of Defense. Secretary Langley requests your presence immediately." Grace nodded, stepping into the vehicle. The interior was quiet, insulated from the city's noise. She took a deep breath, centering herself. There would be questions about the incident, about her well-being, about the optics. She was ready for them. At the Pentagon, a whirlwind of protocol awaited. Grace was ushered into a secure conference room where Secretary Langley and several high-ranking officials sat around a polished table. The air was thick with concern and barely restrained anger. "Grace, are you all right?" Langley asked, his voice low. "I'm fine," she replied, her tone clipped. "But I'm not the one we should be worried about." Langley's jaw tightened. "The officers have been suspended pending investigation. Internal Affairs and the Department of Justice are both involved. The mayor's office is demanding answers." Grace nodded, unsurprised. They'll want to know if this was just an isolated incident or a sign of something deeper. One of the legal advisors spoke up. "General, we need a full account of what happened. The officers failed to read you your Miranda rights, and there was no probable cause for the stop or search. This is a clear violation of your civil rights." Grace recounted the incident in detail, her voice steady. She described the officers' demeanor, their justification, the escalation, the handcuffs. She didn't embellish or dramatize, she didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. A military legal officer took notes. "We'll coordinate with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Because you're a federal officer. This case may fall under federal jurisdiction as a possible civil rights violation." Langley leaned forward. "We'll also be conducting a full review of the officers' records, every stop, every complaint. If there's a pattern, we'll find it." Grace listened, but her thoughts drifted to the broader implications. She knew the system, its strengths, its flaws. She knew that justice in America was often a matter of who you were, who you knew, and whether someone was watching. Most people, she said quietly, don't have the Pentagon on speed dial. What happens to them? The room fell silent. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. A communications director broke the silence. "General, the media has footage. The story's already viral. There's pressure from advocacy groups, from Congress, from the public. How do you want to respond?" Grace considered. "I want the truth out. Not just about what happened to me, but about why it keeps happening. I want accountability, not just for these officers, but for the system that made them think this was acceptable." Langley nodded. "We'll support you, whatever you decide." As the meeting ended, Grace was escorted to a private office. She sat by the window, looking out over the city. Below, people went about their lives, unaware of the storm brewing above. Her phone buzzed, messages from friends, colleagues, strangers. Some offered support, others shared their own stories of injustice. Grace read them all, feeling the weight of their hopes and fears. She knew the investigation would be thorough. Internal Affairs would review body cam footage, interview witnesses, examine the officers' records. The district attorney would decide whether to press charges. If the case went to trial, a jury, ordinary citizens, would decide guilt or innocence. And if her rights had been violated, she could pursue a civil lawsuit, seeking damages and systemic change. But Grace also knew that justice was not just about punishment. It was about truth, about change, about making sure that what happened to her did not happen to someone else. As dusk settled over Washington, Grace made a silent vow. She would not let this moment pass quietly. She would use her voice, her story, her position, not just to clear her own name, but to demand a reckoning for all those whose stories never made the news. In the heart of American power, Grace Williams prepared for her next battle, not on a distant battlefield, but within the halls of justice, where the fight for dignity and equality was far from over. That night, Grace sat alone in her apartment, the city lights flickering beyond the window. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a hollow ache in her chest. She poured herself a glass of water and sat at her desk. Surrounded by framed photographs, her parents, both now gone, her graduation from West Point, her first command, the faces of soldiers she'd led and lost. She closed her eyes and let her mind drift back to Birmingham, Alabama, where she'd grown up. The red clay streets, the magnolia trees, the church bells on Sunday morning. She remembered walking to school with her brother, heads held high as neighbors whispered and pointed. The Williams kids, they'd say, the ones who don't know their place. Her father, a civil rights lawyer, had taught her to read the Constitution before she could ride a bike. "This is your shield," he'd say, tapping the battered book. "And your sword. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Her mother, a teacher, had filled their home with books and music and hope, even when hope was hard to come by. Grace remembered the first time she'd been stopped by police, just a teenager, walking home after dark. She'd learned then how quickly suspicion could turn to accusation, how easily dignity could be stripped away. She'd learned to keep her hands visible, her voice calm, her anger hidden. In the army, she'd faced other battles, doubted, dismissed, overlooked. But she'd fought for every promotion, every command, every ounce of respect. She'd earned her stars not just through strategy and skill, but through resilience, the kind forged in the crucible of prejudice. Now, as she stared at her reflection in the dark window, Grace wondered if anything had truly changed. She was a general, a leader, a symbol of progress. But on that street, in the eyes of those officers, she'd been reduced to a threat, a suspect, a body to be controlled. She opened her laptop and began to write not a report, but a letter. To her parents, to the soldiers she'd led, to the young women who looked up to her. She wrote about fear and courage, about justice and injustice, about the long road still ahead. When she finished, she felt lighter, as if she'd laid down a burden she'd carried for too long. She closed her eyes and whispered a promise: "I'll keep fighting. For me, for all of us." The following week, Grace requested a meeting with Officers Miller and Sanders. The internal affairs investigation was ongoing, but she wanted to face them not as an adversary, but as a human being. The meeting took place in a neutral conference room with a mediator present. Miller and Sanders looked nervous, their uniforms crisp, but their faces pale. Grace began. "I asked for this meeting because I believe in accountability, but I also believe in dialogue. I want to understand what happened, not just to me, but to you." Miller shifted in his seat. "We were following procedure," he said, his voice defensive. "We get calls about suspicious vehicles all the time. We have to act." Grace nodded. "Procedure is important, but so is judgment. So is humanity. Did you ever stop to think about how it feels to be stopped, questioned, handcuffed, for no reason other than fitting a description?" Sanders looked down. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't want to. I was scared. I didn't know who you were." Grace's voice softened. "That's the problem. You shouldn't have to know someone's rank or title to treat them with respect." The mediator asked if they wanted to continue. Grace nodded. "I'm not here to ruin your careers. I want you to learn from this. I want you to see the person, not just the profile. I want you to understand the power you hold and the responsibility that comes with it." Miller swallowed hard. "What would you have us do differently?" "Listen," Grace said simply. "Ask questions. Don't assume. And remember that every person you stop is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's hope." The meeting ended with no easy answers, but with the first steps toward understanding. As Grace left the room, she felt a glimmer of hope that change, however slow, was possible. The legal process moved forward with relentless precision. Internal Affairs completed their investigation, reviewing body cam footage, interviewing witnesses, and combing through the officers' records. The district attorney's office weighed the evidence, considering charges of unlawful detention and civil rights violations. Grace's attorney kept her informed at every step. "You have the right to pursue civil action against the department," he reminded her. "But you also have the right to speak out, to use your story to push for reform." The media coverage was intense. News outlets replayed the footage of Grace's arrest, sparking debate across the country. Some viewers saw a hero wronged, others saw an overreaction. On social media, hashtags trended, petitions circulated, and calls for police reform grew louder. Grace chose to testify at a public hearing, her words broadcast to millions. "This isn't just about me," she told the panel. "It's about every person who's been stopped, searched, or arrested because of the color of their skin. It's about a system that too often confuses suspicion with evidence, power with justice." The officers faced disciplinary action and mandatory retraining. The department announced new protocols, improved bias training, clearer guidelines for stops and searches, and a renewed commitment to community engagement. But Grace knew that real change would take more than policies. It would take courage from officers, from leaders, from citizens willing to hold the system accountable. Months passed. The city moved on, but Grace's life was forever changed. She returned to her duties at the Pentagon, her resolve stronger than ever. She began speaking at schools, community centers, and police academies, sharing her story and listening to others. She met with lawmakers, advocating for reforms to ensure that what happened to her would not happen to others. She mentored young officers, teaching them the values her parents had instilled in her: empathy, integrity, justice. One morning, Grace received a letter from Sanders. "Thank you," he wrote. "You made me see things differently. I'm trying to do better." Grace smiled, hope blooming in her chest. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. But she also knew that change was possible, one conversation, one policy, one act of courage at a time. As she walked through the Pentagon's halls, her uniform crisp, her head high, she felt the weight of history on her shoulders and the promise of a better future. Years later, Grace stood at the dedication of a new community center in Washington, D.C., a place for dialogue, education, and healing. The crowd included police officers, activists, students, and families from every corner of the city. In her speech, Grace reflected on her journey. "Justice is not a destination," she said. "It's a path we walk together, sometimes stumbling, sometimes running, always reaching for something better." She spoke of her parents, of the lessons they'd taught her, of the battles fought and the victories won. She spoke of the officers who had stopped her and of the conversations that followed. She spoke of the power of stories, how they could wound, but also heal, how they could divide, but also unite. As the sun set over the city, Grace looked out at the faces before her, young and old, hopeful and weary. She saw in them the future she had always believed in. A future where justice was not just a word, but a promise. And as she left the stage, applause echoing behind her, Grace Williams knew that her fight had not been in vain. She had turned pain into purpose, injustice into action, and a moment of darkness into a beacon of hope for generations to come.